Hey, Arn. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
What's
that?
Good. It's great. We got you on camera right now.
Great.
So it's great to see you. Happy holidays. How's all the kids getting ready for everything?
Yeah. Both Heather and I have some travel. She's back from London yesterday. She's got to run to Saudi Arabia in a couple of days, and then I'm gonna go to Austin tomorrow. Come back on Thursday for a speech. So it's been busy.
Well,
good busy.
And you've been traveling a lot.
Been traveling a lot. Seattle, Minneapolis, New York, Cincinnati, Los Angeles. That was a big one.
Well, let me introduce you to the people who are watching this. This is John Kiriakou, who's a former CIA agent who was stationed in Pakistan during and with the CIA until 2005 or 2006? Four. And one of his greatest moments was capturing Abu Zubaydah, he was number 3 on the terrorist list under al-Qaida. And I may have time to ask you a little bit about that. And then in 2007 did an interview and gave information about the CIA torture and consequently was arrested and served almost 3 years in jail and was released earlier this year. So he's a hero. He also has multiple degrees. He speaks multiple languages, both Arabic and Greek and English. He's traveled through many of the countries in the Middle East and Europe, has served our country both in Greece, Pakistan. During the Gulf War, he was stationed, or his job was managing the information with Iraq. So he's a wealth of information. We could talk to him for hours. But you know where I would like to start, John, is where is your head right now? What are you thinking about? What are you seeing and paying attention to as an analyst and as a person working for the Institute for Public Policy Studies?
You know, to tell you the truth, I'm trying to get away from the whole whistleblower thing. That has, I think, a finite life to it. And I spent so many years in government working on the Middle East and on terrorism. I mean, to tell you the truth, I was one of the government's leading experts on the Middle East. I have educated Eastern studies. I concentrated on Islamic theology. I speak the language. I know the religion. And I'd like to get back into Middle Eastern analysis. So with the advent of ISIS and other problems, frankly, that we're having in the region, whether it's Syria and Iraq or Libya or Iran, I'd like to focus more than I have over the past several years on the Middle East.
Great, because that's where I wanted to go in the interview, so I'll just get right there. We have a president that has indicted more whistleblowers than anyone in the history of the United States. Most people don't know that. He's bombing 7 countries. He's pretty much perfected the use of drones. Every week, and we've communicated over the past couple of weeks, we're seeing a new turn of event in the Middle East. I contacted you a couple weeks ago when Turkey took down the plane in the Russian jet right before Thanksgiving. A lot of information has come out since then as to what might be. ISIS is selling oil both to Assad and to Turkey. So could you pull away some of the layers of the onion here and tell us what you think's happening?
Yeah, sure. But first, I think there are no good guys in this entire situation. What ISIS is doing vis-a-vis oil sales is really very typical of what extremist groups have done over the past 15 or 20 years. If they control any territory, they exploit the natural resources in that territory, or not even natural, but the resources in that territory, or they conduct high-level kidnappings. It's really quite a lucrative way of financing your movement. So one of the things that ISIS has done, really from the get-go, is once they began capturing parts of northern Iraq and oil, they kept those oil facilities running so that they could surreptitiously ship the oil across the border into Turkey and then from Turkey onto the gray market. The Iraqis used to do this during the sanctions regime between 1991 and 2004, 2003. ISIS knew that it worked. Iraqi military officers, who now largely make up ISIS's leadership, already had the relationship with Turks on the other side of the border who could take the transit oil. And so this is really the main way in which ISIS earns its money. There are other groups, though, al-Qaida in the Islamic Maghreb, for example, that's active in North Africa and the Sahel. And they tend to favor kidnapping because there is no oil in the Sahel, or there's very, very little oil in the Sahel. So what they'll do is they'll kidnap Italians or French or Belgians or South Africans, knowing full well that their governments will pay a ransom very quietly, and then that's how they raise their money. So this is really nothing new, and the reason why these groups are doing it is because it's so successful.
But you said there are no good guys in any of this. Turkey is a NATO nation. The United States is selling weapons to Turkey. The United States is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is financing al-Nusra, possibly ISIS. Do you think that ISIS is somehow doing some of the dirty work for any of our allies or the United States in order to topple Assad?
I do. The Turks really have no inherent beef with ISIS. ISIS hasn't really directly attacked Turkey as a country or the Turks, but they have a common enemy in the Kurds. And so, the United States begged Turkey to get involved in this fight and to allow us to use Incirlik Air Base. And the Turks, played hard to get for a little while and then announced that they would indeed come in on the side of the Allies and immediately began buying Kurdish positions along the border. Well, so really, Turkey's not doing much of anything to help the Allies against ISIS. The Turks actually like the status quo, where they're making money from the transshipment of the oil, and they have Western permission to bomb the Kurds as well.
Well, you have no love lost for the CIA, nor do you for President Obama. So what involvement do you think that they have in Syria and Iraq?
Well, I think CIA involvement in Syria has been an absolute debacle. They created this ridiculous organization called the Free Syrian Army, spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to train almost nobody, and then announced at the very end that it was an utter failure and it just fell apart with no plan to do anything beyond that. Really, the White House's only plan is to encourage our so-called allies involved. And when I say so-called, I mean allies like you pointed out, Saudi Arabia, that frankly funds ISIS and Nusra. Maybe not the Saudi government, but certainly wealthy Saudis, businessmen, and even royal family members. We've seen this for decades, where Saudis were financing Afghan Arabs during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and even during the U.S.'s war with al-Qaida and the Taliban. We see Saudi nationals funding al-Qaida in the Islamic Maghreb. They're funding al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula. This is an ongoing thing with the Saudis, and it's something that neither the White House nor the CIA have ever really addressed with the Saudi government.
You broke up, but you said the United States' role is to encourage. Is that the word you used?
To encourage our Arab allies to do something, but we're encouraging the wrong Arabs. We're encouraging the Saudis. In fact, the Saudis are on the wrong side of this issue.
There's a lot of scholars that are writing that the United States might be having an ulterior motive that's not a very healthy one for our best interests in the Middle East. Are you seeing any of that? Do you think that there's a desire to have Syria destabilized for oil interests with the vying between the two pipeline negotiations that have been going on for the past year?
I don't think we're that smart, to be perfectly honest with you. I think that that we've got a stupid policy, and it's stupid because it's stupid, not because there's an ulterior motive. We don't learn from our mistakes historically, and anytime there's trouble in the Middle East, our knee-jerk reaction is to send troops. If we decide we don't like somebody, we decide to overthrow that person, whether or not there's a plan for a transition to a peaceful government afterwards. Look at Saddam Hussein. We provided Saddam Hussein with top-secret intelligence during his war with Iran. Now, this was a war of Iraqi aggression against Iran, but we provided the Iraqis with intelligence to keep that war going. When we decided we didn't like Saddam Hussein anymore, we decided to overthrow him. So we attack Iraq, we overthrow Saddam Hussein, who was the only bulwark in the region against Iranian expansionism. And now we've got a Shia government in Iraq that is friendly with the Iranians and that is hostile to many of the region's Sunni kingdoms and emirates. And we can't figure out why the Iranians feel empowered all of a sudden.
When you say we didn't like Saddam, it was also, he was nationalizing the oil. And so was...
Well, no, the oil had been nationalized many years earlier. The oil had been nationalized by President Bakr after the '68 revolution. So it wasn't Saddam nationalizing Iraqi oil. It was already nationalized when he was vice president.
Got it. Okay. So it was just merely we didn't like what he was doing, and so we went in there. And what he was doing at the time was there was a conflict with Kuwait, and there's discrepancy as to whether or not Kuwait was starting to drill cross borders into Iraq, and whether or not Kuwait provoked Assad. I mean, Saddam.
Yeah, well, I think that there really wasn't any confusion about whether or not the Iraqis were slant drilling. I mean, the Kuwaitis were slant drilling. They were slant drilling, and they were frankly stealing Iraqi oil. But they had been doing that for many years, and the Iraqis knew that they were doing it. I mean, I'm not trying to paint a revisionist picture of Saddam Hussein. This was a very, very bad man. This guy he committed genocide, and there were some just human rights horrors that were committed by Saddam's command in Kuwait. But with that said, strategically, over a long term, it would have served the United States better to allow a contained Saddam Hussein to remain in power in Iraq than it would have been to overthrow him and to allow him to exert influence in the country.
Right. What I'm trying to get to, without trying to take up too much of your time, is that since Kosovo, the United States has started to go into foreign countries with we'll say, under the auspices of humanitarian interests. And it's picking and choosing which countries to go into. Obviously, we're not trying to help Yemen, with thousands of people being killed by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. We're not in certain countries in Africa. So all of a sudden, in the last 6 months, the rhetoric is built up very high on why we're in Syria. And it's becoming increasingly more apparent that we're there to get Assad out of power. Because and what's being said in Senate hearings as of last week is because Assad is a bad guy, he's killing people. Obviously, there is a lot of wrongs going on, Assad, ISIS, those type of things. However, what is not clear to me and other people is, why would we try to bring troops into Syria when we don't have authorization to bring troops into Syria, when what looks apparent is we're not necessarily going after ISIS. You know, ISIS is in 7 countries. We're only bombing 2. An example like, what's the city in Syria, Raqqa. In Raqqa, it's a city of 200,000 people. You're an analyst. There's 2,000 ISIS fighters in Raqqa, and 4 countries are bombing the heck out of Raqqa. Well, that just doesn't make sense to somebody like me, because you can only bomb so many targets before you've exhausted everything that you could be doing. So what's really happening on the ground in Syria and Iraq? Are we really trying to degrade and destroy ISIS? Or is this just something we're telling the American people so they feel like we're trying to do something about it? And tomorrow night's Republican debate is going to be, we should put troops on the ground, we should have a safe zone, and all these things that aren't going to work.
Right. You know, when you look at the genesis of the problem with ISIS, it was created because of American policy failures. ISIS was created in an American military prison in Iraq in 2005, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and friends and cohorts formerly of the Iraqi army got together and decided that they would launch a Sunni military and opposition group to fight the Shia government in Iraq. The Iraqis weren't equipped to fight something like that. Especially an organization militarily led by some of Saddam Hussein's top former generals. And then they began capturing thousands of pieces of American military hardware. And that's what they're using in this fight. It's American military hardware provided by the United States to the Iraqi government that was very easily captured by ISIS. That's point one. Point two, you make a very important point, in that ISIS is in 7 countries. We're only bombing, or we're only fighting them in 2, and we're bombing really, I think, indiscriminately, if press reports are to be believed. But I'll go one better. There are a lot of countries in the world, despotic leaders. There are a lot of countries in the world where governments don't respect human rights. We didn't intervene in Rwanda, for example. We didn't intervene in East Timor. I mean, there are dozens of examples around the world where, if we really had this respect, this overarching respect for human rights that we profess to have, we should have been intervening all over the place. But these other countries don't have oil. And these other countries aren't tied to the Middle East and tied to the Middle East, like Iraq and Syria are. Now, my final point would be, this is a situation in Syria where there's no good outcome, but you can choose an outcome that's less terrible than other outcomes. And the only outcome that's less terrible that is available to us, I think, is that we need to start talking to Bashar al-Assad. And we need to start negotiating with the Assad government. And we need to start working with the Russians to make sure that there's a viable government in Damascus that can help all of us to work together to fight ISIS. And I don't see that ever happening while this administration's in power.
The thing that the news isn't covering, and that is not happening in congressional hearings with foreign relations, armed services, is with last week I watched 3.5 hours of Ash Carter present to John McCain. What is shocking to me is the lack of details that a Secretary of Defense gives in any, now forget what is confidential information, or that, I'm just, something doesn't smell right here, okay? He is saying he has everything that he needs being provided by the president in order to degrade and destroy ISIS, okay? He has said, on the one hand, that they've made advancements where people, where the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, I believe, has said that they aren't making advances. It doesn't matter, all right? What doesn't smell right to me is there's clearly not a military strategy, and there's really not a political goal. So what they're doing, and what has happened since Vietnam, is they just don't want to look like they're weak. They don't want to look like they're backing off. As you said, it's a very complicated issue, and therefore they have to look like they're attempting to do something. Meanwhile, we're in an election year, and we have Republicans stirring the pot by saying we could do more. Mm-hmm. The only other opportunities that are presented in order to do more is to put more troops on the ground, and the delta between how many we have and what they are crying out for is 5,000 to 10,000 troops, which during 2007 there was 180,000 troops. So we know that's not going to make all that much of a difference, right?
Right.
Okay. The other thing they're now calling out for is a safe zone, which is a buffer between Turkey and Syria, so that ISIS isn't getting arms back and forth across the Turkish border, correct? And right. But what they're for the Syrian refugees to not go into Europe and to be able to be staying there. And the military is saying it'd take 30,000 troops in order to protect a safe zone and make that operational. So that
this is it. See, all of our plans include the commitment of ground troops. So you can have people like Ash Carter or the president promising that there isn't going to be an uptick in the number of ground troops we send, and that's just not possible. The only ideas that the administration is floating, at least the ideas that are reaching the press, include ground troops. So I just don't see how the administration expects to accomplish anything if there's no overall plan. And now you've made another important point here too, and that is that there doesn't seem to be coordination between the allies. Well, in fact, in the press, the only coordination that's even being discussed is coordination over what targets to bomb. So what is the plan? What is the strategy? I don't think there is a strategy.
Well, the most recent twist to this plot is the Iraqi prime minister is stating that he does not want Allied ground troops. This came out on Friday. Does not want Allied ground troops in Iraq. Mm-hmm. So you have a government that we supported for 13 years saying that this is very similar to what has been going on in Afghanistan. They want control. They obviously cannot do anything to stop ISIS in their country because they don't have a very organized military. Mm-hmm. And so what that, again, if I'm going to bring it to 2 points. First, this one. That kind of says that the only place that we could play war games is in Syria. Mm-hmm. And the common denominator is people want Assad out of power who are in the allies. And the reason, well, first of all, we did that to Gaddafi, and that was a disaster.
It's been chaos ever since.
Right. And now they're trying to put a peace agreement together, and that's coming out in the news today and over the weekend. The other issue is that why would we want Assad out of power? We're not I feel as though we're not doing this because we're the great humanitarian and police state. We want him out of power because there's oil interests that are going on. And
I'm not sure I'm that cynical because there's really very little oil in Syria. I think we want him out of power because he won't do what we tell him to do. I think that's really what it is.
And what would we want him to do?
And whatever it is, anything we say. I mean, look back over the last 15 years or so, or even going back earlier to 1991 when his father was in power, Hafez al-Assad. Secretary of State James Baker made a trip to Damascus and said, look, we're going to attack the Iraqis in Kuwait. We're going to push them out. We have the Saudis. We have the GCC. We have the Egyptians. We have the Turks. We want your help. And the Syrians helped us to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Fast forward, President George W. Bush went to Bashar al-Assad after the death of his father. He became the leader of Syria. And we said, we're going to attack Iraq. We have your Arab allies. We have the Jordanians. We have the GCC. We have the Egyptians. We have the Turks. We want your help. He told us to go fly a kite. And on top of that, he would not allow us overflight clearance to supply the Kurds from Jordan. So we had to fly from Jordan across Israel, out over the Mediterranean, loop around, cross Turkey, and come south from Turkey. Okay? It made the trip much longer. It made the trip very dangerous.
Well,
Never gave him for that.
Well,
so wouldn't it stand to reason that we would want to install who not only would do what we told him to do, but would end this decades-long close relationship with you? That makes sense to me.
With a decade-long relationship with who?
The Iranians.
Okay.
Decades.
Well,
multiple decades.
And Russia, because Russia has a naval base there.
The Russians have been friendly with the Syrians since the 1950s.
Right.
It's pretty much Russia's only ally in the Middle East.
And I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm referencing many different articles, but you're probably familiar with Pepe Escobar, a journalist who's written an article that this has to do with also with the issue of the pipelines. One is would benefit the Russia and Iran, and the other would benefit Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And so because we don't have a lot of time, I want to jump to one other piece of the puzzle. Syria borders the northern Israel. One of the areas between that is the Golan Heights, which Israel took in 1967. Or however you could clarify that for me, because I'm not clear on that point. But Israel has been very, very silent.
Sure.
On the conflict in Syria.
Yeah, very silent.
Israel is not known for being quiet on anything.
Right.
Why is this happening?
Because the Israelis support Assad. It's very simple. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And the Israelis have had a very long period of peace with Syria. It's a de facto peace. They're still arguing about the Golan Heights. I mean, not really, but in public they are. But the Syrians know that Assad is no threat to them. He never has been. His father really wasn't a threat to them after the 73 war. And so they like things just the way they are. Now, if ISIS takes over control of Syria, all bets are off. And I think the Israelis would probably be wise to assume that ISIS would attack them soon after taking power. And that's why the Israelis haven't played a role in this whole thing, because they don't want to be drawn in. They don't want to turn otherwise neutral players against them and for ISIS by really taking a public stand. They just quietly support Assad.
All right. Well, it seems as though with what NATO has been doing and encroaching further east into Russia, that this has a lot of similarities of what's going on between this almost, and I don't want to say it's a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia in Syria, but it has a lot of similarities to that. And we now have Russia saying that they have not taken nuclear weapons off the table as a threat to ISIS. They're now ramping up the type of military operations that they're doing, and none of what they're doing is going after ISIS. They're going after some asymmetrical tactics or strategies towards either Turkey, NATO, or the United States.
Yeah, this is a brilliant opportunity for the Russians to test out their new equipment and to give their pilots real-life training in air battles. This is something that the Russians have been looking forward to for many, many years. And frankly, it's something that we do all the time. I mean, when we launch these, no-fly zones or bombing runs, these are really training exercises using live weapons. And this is how we ensure that our pilots are the best in the world. Well, the Russians have been left out of that over the last few decades. And now this is their turn to train their pilots and to test their weapons.
Wow. Okay, to shift gears so I can let you go. In a recent interview with Jared Leto, that I'm going to post, and I'm going to post other things that you've done, and I've got up here on the screen how people could support you through your different funding, because you have John's given up so much for the United States in order to let us know about how things are really working. He doesn't want to be considered the torture guy anymore. And what's really important about what John has said recently is that we're losing our civil liberties. That the CIA since 2001 has been lying to us, is his exact words, and he wants to get this information out. So, John, what could you say to people who are listening about how critically important it is for us to stand up and speak out to protect our civil liberties, and how would they do that?
I'm very pained that most Americans seem to have been willing, since the passage of the Patriot Act in October of 2001, to just give up many of the civil liberties that they've enjoyed, really since the creation of the country, without so much as a debate. We're not seeing demonstrations in the streets. We're not seeing rallies on Capitol Hill. And in fact, it seems like every time the government wants to pass legislation, it includes something that strips us of some of our personal freedoms. This is something that Americans really have to oppose. Now, whether it has to do with torture or with privacy is a very important issue right now, especially as it relates to cyber privacy. We need to ride our elected officials, and we need to force them to understand that we are not willing to give up these rights without a fight. We should tell them that the Patriot Act is unconstitutional, it needs to be changed, and that Americans have an inherent right to privacy. It's something that we haven't done yet, and it's very important to me.
So the way they do it sometimes is nibbling around the edges, and the most recent one is encryption.
Right.
Explain how they're using encryption now to take away our personal freedoms.
Right. You know, encryption is such an important issue that I think most Americans don't understand. I've got my iPhone right here, and on my iPhone, I've got some encrypted apps. I have something called Signal. I have another app called Red Phone that allows me to make an encrypted phone call. I have another thing called WhatsApp that's encrypted. And it's encrypted because I don't want the government intercepting my communications. The government has no right to intercept my communications without a warrant. We have constitutional guarantees of due process. And so without a warrant, the government has no right to know what I'm saying in my emails or my text messages or my telephone calls. Now, the government, most particularly FBI Director Comey, argues that encrypted applications are what the terrorists are using to communicate. First of all, that is just simply not true. If you look at the communications between the Paris attackers, they used online gaming systems to communicate. Those gaming systems were not encrypted. They were out there in the ether for anybody to intercept. And in fact, NSA, CIA, and FBI did not intercept those communications. I call that an intelligence failure, not a problem with encryption. Now, even in San Bernardino, they're talking about encryption having been used. I would counter that just decent police work would have disrupted that attack. The FBI knew that Syed Farouk was in contact with a known terrorist overseas, yet they did nothing about it. They never questioned him. They never detained him. They never sought a warrant to go into his home or into his electronics. They just let him go. That was bad police work. So it's not that encryption is preventing the FBI from doing its job. It's that the FBI is bad at doing its job. That's not the American people's fault, and that's not a reason to ban encryption.
So what are the 2 or 3 things that Americans should be contacting the representatives about?
Well, number one, I think we should be, like I said, writing our elected officials to ensure that personal encryption remains legal. Another thing that we should be talking to our elected officials about is the repeal of the Patriot Act. NSA, Arn, has in its charter that it is forbidden from spying on American citizens. In fact, now much of what NSA does is to spy on American citizens. So we need hard and fast laws that protect us from the long arm of the NSA, and we have no such law. And the third thing is, we've never really settled on the torture issue. We need to make sure that torture never rears its ugly head again.
Well, the president, the day before Christmas, signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which was, I think, unprecedented 2-year budget approval, to which I can't understand how they were allowed to do that. But he vetoed it originally weeks earlier because he wanted to have Guantanamo closed.
Yes.
And now he's not going to do that, and there's almost 100 people who are have been imprisoned for 13, 14 years without due process. Mm-hmm. And they just released someone who had been arrested, who had been in there for 13 years, who they had the wrong identity on.
Yes.
Would that be a fourth issue that you think? And how would the president, through executive orders, release the move the remaining 100 prisoners, and why?
I've not understood the cowardice of the Republican Party on this issue. It seems like every Republican senator and every Republican congressman has this irrational fear of a terrorist serving his time in a prison in these congressmen's districts or senators' states, as though we don't have dangerous people in our maximum security prisons right now. If we're going to be Americans in the spirit of America and showing respect to the Constitution, we will take the prisoners that we have at Guantanamo. We will charge those who have committed a crime with a crime. We will give them their day in court. And if they're found guilty, we would incarcerate them in an American prison. If we're not going to do that, they should be released. They've not been charged with a crime. They've not been found guilty of a crime. They've not been able to face their accusers in court. To me, that means they're not guilty of anything, and they should be released. I regret that the president has not had the guts to close Guantanamo in the 7+ years that he's been president, or 7 years that he's been president. With that said, the Republicans are at least as guilty as the president is on this issue. So yeah, Guantanamo is the fourth thing that we need to force action on. Unfortunately, though, I think the American people seem to prefer the status quo.
Well, I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to you in detail about what's going on. All of these issues lead up to breeding more terrorism, spending taxpayers' dollars more ridiculously instead of using them domestically for things that we need here. It's killing innocent people. John is one of the few people who stood up in order to protect all this, so I'd really like you to support him. His book is The Reluctant Spy. I'll have links to other things. John, you're an amazing person. Thank you.
You're a great guy, Aaron. Thanks a lot for doing this.
All right. Take care.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.